Hi, WWII students. It's time for another one of those great flipped lectures from one of your awesome history teachers. Grab your notebook, grab a pen, and get ready to take some good notes. Reminder, you can use these to help you on a review quiz and also on the final. Screenshots do not count. Today's subject, African American Civil Rights Movement, the nonviolent portion. Learning targets. Through notes, primary source study, and discussion, I can evaluate the need for a civil rights movement, can describe the nonviolent actions of the civil rights movement, and I can summarize the accomplishments of the civil rights movement. Let's get started. African American Civil Rights Movement, nonviolent. Need for change. 1880s Jim Crow laws. After the Civil War, a series of amendments were designed to give rights to the freedmen. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment gave citizenship rights to African Americans. In the 15th, African American males were given the right to vote. Things should have been equal for the first time, but Southerners were not ready to deal with these changes or accept them. They began to devise new ways to take rights away from African Americans and try and preserve the status quo. They did this through various laws. Some of these laws segregated public facilities, Jim Crow laws. These laws applied to many public places, including schools, hospitals, restaurants, parks, playgrounds, and much more. By the late 1880s, segregation was ingrained in Southern life. Now the question was whether the federal government would try to enforce the Civil Rights Amendments. The test came in 1896 in Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy, a black man, sued a railroad because he was denied a seat in a car reserved for white passengers. The Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities were legal. Segregation in the Jim Crow South was here to stay. World War I and World War II. Segregation was present in the U.S. military too. During World War I, African Americans served in segregated units. They were confined to non-combat roles, and officers tended to be white. The only combat scene was from the Harlem Hellfighters, who fought bravely under the French. In World War II, African American servicemen experienced more segregation, although they were more involved in combat and leadership roles. After World War II, President Truman ended segregation in the military in 1948 in Executive Order 9981 in response to African American contributions to the war and rising pressure in the African American community. 1950s, conditions in the South. In the 1950s, segregation was still in place. Schools were separate, but in fact very unequal. African American schools received less funding than their white counterparts. They oftentimes received secondhand supplies from white schools. Unequal treatment under the law still persisted. Jim Crow laws continued with separate drinking fountains and segregation in public facilities. To counteract the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote for African American males, voting restrictions were put in place to limit the African American vote. First, poll taxes were put in place. A poll tax is an amount of money that had to be paid in order to vote. Since many African Americans in the South were poor, many could not afford to vote. Since many whites in the South were also poor, they created the literacy test as well. Since African Americans went to separate and poorly funded schools, they were difficult to pass. Many local governments in the South, including mayor, city council, and police, enforced laws differently for blacks and whites as well. The black community also faced violence. Lynchings were common in the African American world. Lynchings are where mobs choose to kill someone, usually by hanging, for a supposed slight or breaking of a law. Emmett Till, who is from Chicago, was visiting relatives in the South, and he was lynched because he supposedly talked to a white woman. The Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, intimidated blacks by burning crosses in front lawns, by their presence at polling places, or through actual violence for those who broke those rules. Take a look at these photographs, looking at the school situation. On the left, we have the situation for the white school in Macon, Georgia, and on the right, we have the other two schools that are separate from the same area. Is this separate but equal? So this brings us to the civil rights movement itself, actions and obstacles. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. One of the first actions in the civil rights movement centered on trying to end segregation in the schools. Linda Brown, an 8-year-old, was denied access to an all-white school which was only a few blocks from her home. She had to attend an all-black school. Along the way, she had to cross a dangerous railroad yard and then take a bus for 21 blocks to reach her school. Her father, along with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, sued. The Supreme Court unanimously agreed that schools should be integrated, ruling that separate schools were not equal. Many southern states refused to comply with the ruling, so a year later, the Supreme Court ordered school authorities in the South to make a prompt and reasonable start towards carrying out the decision with all deliberate speed. Still, many schools refused to change and integrate. The first major battleground for integrating the schools was Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Even some politicians supported the status quo. I draw a line in the sand and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Governor of Alabama, George Wallace, inaugural address, January 14th, 1963. Civil disobedience. At the time the movement went beyond the Supreme Court, many of their protests included civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is choosing to break a law that is unfair. It is a choice by the protester and consciously done. The protester understands that they may face arrest and jail. Additionally, following in Gandhi's footsteps, protesters in the African American movement were peaceful. They came up with guidelines and rules to try and remain peaceful. Martin Luther King Jr. and many other protesters preached nonviolence and followed these beliefs in their protests. Montgomery Bus Boycott, 1956. On December 1st, 1955, seamstress Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat for a white person and was arrested. The NAACP and Martin Luther King Jr. organized a boycott of the bus system until they were integrated. The black community of Montgomery, Alabama, made up 75% of the bus company's customers, so a boycott would hurt the company. After 1 year, the boycott was successful and Montgomery buses were integrated. The Supreme Court ruled that segregated buses were illegal in November 1956. The first major win of the civil rights movement had happened. Rosa Parks became seen as a mother of the movement, and Martin Luther King Jr. gained national fame and formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. 1960 sit-ins. On February 1st, 1960, 4 black college students sat down at a lunch counter in Woolworth's and ordered coffee. Management refused to serve them, following the segregation laws. The students remained at the counter until the store closed. They returned the next day with more students, and they sat quietly that day and the next day and the next, despite being taunted. They remained nonviolent and peaceful, despite physical threats. Within 2 weeks, the sit-in movement had spread across other lunch counters in the South. It became a model for other protests. In a similar fashion, sleep-ins were done in motel lobbies. Play-ins were held in parks, read-ins in libraries, watch-ins in movies, and bed-ins in bingo halls, swim-ins on restricted beaches, and more. Within 6 months, Woolworth store in Greensboro desegregated, along with hundreds of other facilities in the South. A new movement had been spurned. 1961, Freedom Rides. CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality, decided to test a Supreme Court decision that was not being recognized. CORE was a civil rights group that included both blacks and whites and many students. They advocated nonviolent protest methods as well. The Freedom Rides were designed to test Supreme Court decision of Morgan v. Virginia, which outlawed segregation in interstate travel and was not being enforced in the South. On May 4, 1961, blacks and whites rode the buses together to integrate them. They traveled across the South. They were beaten by mobs, and a bus was firebombed in Anniston, both instigated by the KKK. The local police did nothing to intervene and protect the protesters. Attorney General Robert Kennedy sent in federal marshals to protect the riders and ordered the Interstate Commerce Commission to order interstate trains, buses, airplanes, and other transportation to be integrated. 1963, March on Washington. Building public pressure from the movement and from the American public caused President Kennedy to back a civil rights bill publicly and urge Congress to draft one. To show support for the civil rights bill, the March on Washington was planned. 250,000 people met in Washington, D.C. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech, "I Have a Dream." He explained the hopes pinned to the future for future generations. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." 2 weeks after the march, the church in Birmingham was bombed. 4 young girls were killed. Kennedy was assassinated shortly afterwards. Lyndon B. Johnson became president. Although a Southerner, Johnson supported the Civil Rights Bill and was able to get it passed, using his political savvy and clout. 1964 Voting Rights Drive. Now that the goal of ending segregation was about complete with the Civil Rights Bill, attention in the Civil Rights Movement turned towards the vote for African Americans. In the summer of 1964, a voting rights drive, nicknamed Freedom Summer, was organized by college students. Several thousand black and white college students spent the summer in Mississippi trying to help register the state's black voters. They helped them pass literacy tests, accompanied them to polling places to avoid intimidation, and raised money to pay poll taxes. Additionally, they held freedom schools and helped out the community. The black community faced severe intimidation, and the civil rights workers experienced violence. 3 volunteers were murdered, 2 white and 1 black. 3 others were shot, 80 were beaten, and more than 1,000 were arrested. In Mississippi, local officials did not charge anyone for the 3 murders. It was up to the federal court to bring charges against 7 individuals related to the murders. None of them served more than 6 years, but it was the first time in Mississippi since Reconstruction that white men were convicted of civil rights violations. In Alabama in March of 1965, the voting rights movement led to marches from Selma to Montgomery. The police used billy clubs and tear gas against the crowd marchers. This violence caused the federal government to protect the marchers. The marchers were escorted the rest of the way by the Alabama National Guard, the U.S. Army, federal marshals, and members of the FBI. Accomplishments of the movement. 1964 Civil Rights Act. After Kennedy's assassination, President Johnson fought to get the Civil Rights Act passed. It took 6 months, and Southern states filibustered for 83 days to avoid it. In the end, the act passed. It outlawed discrimination in hiring. The act created the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, to help African Americans obtain fair treatment in businesses and unions. The law once and for all ended segregation in public places. It prohibited discrimination because of race, color, religion, and national origin. All citizens had the right to enter libraries, parks, washrooms, restaurants, and theaters. It forbade discrimination in schools and allowed the Attorney General to file suit to speed up desegregation. While segregation was now illegal, many local governments and police in the South did not follow the laws, causing it to remain an issue. 1964, the 24th Amendment. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in federal elections. Later, the Supreme Court ordered all poll taxes to be abolished, including local elections. The first hurdle against African American voting had been crossed. In 1965, Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended literacy tests and required that federal rather than state examiners must register qualified voters to safeguard the voting rights of African Americans and others on voting day at the polls.